Well, for more on the startup landscape in Iran, I'm joined by Farhad Alavi, Managing Partner of Akrivis Law Group. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So most of the headlines that we tend to hear about Iran, it's very dominated by the sanctions. But as we heard in Elmira's report, there are also opportunities there. So tell us, what's the reality like?
Well, sure. The sanctions obviously grab the headlines. However, and they're very important, and they're important to these companies as well. Externally, I would think that's the biggest challenge that these companies face, the fact that it's very difficult for them to procure certain technologies, certain access to certain services like cloud-based technologies because of the sanctions, paying for these services. Domestically, they have their own challenges as well. However, it's very interesting to see what's been going on because traditionally Iranian businessmen have gone towards investments that yield short-term results in return. And startups traditionally take quite a bit of time before they reach up to speed and start generating profit. So this is a very interesting thing. And also it's interesting because of the fact that Iran has a very strong human capital base. And for whatever reason, it's not been able to channel this into a knowledge-based economy. And it'll be interesting to see how this develops.
As you mentioned, we have a very highly educated young population there. So what are the sort of sectors that are really the strengths in Iran?
I think that Iran could have a lot of potential strengths in a lot of areas, such as computer engineering and software. Other areas, such as medicine and other types of scientific research, they've done particularly well. However, there are a lot of impediments, and the legal landscape externally has prevented them from perhaps utilizing reaching their full potential. And internally, there's obviously the natural challenges that persist in Iran, and on top of what persists in any typical emerging economy.
Now, as you mentioned, we have the pressures inside the country and the pressures outside. If you had to kind of strike the balance, which one would you say actually puts more pressure on the startup landscape there?
There are a lot of pressures internally, I think, that go beyond the sanctions. First off is the fact that the government has traditionally throttled the internet, both in the fixed lines that are delivered to homes and offices, as well as the telecom. And until that's fixed and there's a stable and consistent flow of proper data speeds, I think that will be a big impediment. Naturally, on the other end, you have other issues such as the government, for example, traditionally has been wary of the private sector becoming too large. And that said, though, we see a lot of interesting trends going on, increasing participation of women in these fields, for example, younger people. Iran's traditionally not been an economy where young people have been the drivers, and it'll be interesting to see this new trend all of a sudden. I think the economic pressures from the sanctions in part and the lower price of oil has prompted a lot of people to think about different types of avenues for making a living, and this has been very interesting to monitor.
Now, speaking of different sorts of avenues, and you mentioned women, we're seeing that women are actually in Iran are becoming the majority of science and engineering students. What sort of impact do you think that could have?
It's having all kinds of impacts from the economics and the participation of women in the job force, as well as even political and social impacts as well. Traditionally, for this type of work, I think it has a particular draw for women in Iran because it is private business, and private business, for whatever reasons, has less cultural sensitivities that might be applicable to women in the workforce, for example, less restrictions on what they wear or how they dress, or certain hierarchies that might be more prevalent in the public sector.
So it might be an easier way for them to actually get into business would be more so through the private sector than government.
I think the numbers speak to that, and the participation and the active involvement of many of these women, highly educated in these sectors. I think they have found it to be a much more responsive avenue for their efforts and their accomplishments.
Now, a few years ago, President Rouhani announced a $1 billion fund to help support entrepreneurship. How would you say those policies are working? Are you really seeing a difference, or what sort of policies would you like to see instead? There's
definitely a buzz going on in Iran, and this is being noticed in the press, even in the West, and it's very interesting to see. However, one of the biggest problems in Iran reaching its full potential, Iran is a very rich country, both in terms of natural resources, human resources, which don't get the attention often that they should, internally and externally. However, one of the big problems is Iran's relations with the rest of the world. And once this stabilizes and Iran does reach a détente, not just with the European powers or certain East Asian powers, but also the United States in particular, given the U.S.'s role in the international banking system, in the tech sector, once this happens, I think we will see Iran slowly get up to its rightful role in the international economy. And lastly, as we compare the experiences for Iranian entrepreneurs at home versus perhaps the experiences for Iranian entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. Sure. What's the connection like? Well, I think that Iranian Americans have done particularly well in Silicon Valley and in the United States in general. And this is obviously a big source of pride for the Iranian American community, as well as people back in Iran. Now, the scale of the companies here are, for the time being, going to be unmatched in Iran. But I think that the more we see stability and interest in supporting this sector in Iran, maybe people will revisit those interests of leaving the country.
Well, thank you again to Farhad Alavi, Managing Partner of Akrivis Law Group. Thank you for joining us.